Okay, cool. Well, thank you for coming back, Patrick.
Pleasure, thank you.
And you're watching this a week later, but we're just filming it kind of 10 minutes later, really. Sam has just told me that in the first if you listen to some podcasts, you won't be able to see it. But if you were watching online, apparently I had some tape stuck to my shoe, and it reminded me that many years ago, when I was in the church, there was a bit of pressure to be a bit more dressed up than there is nowadays. And anyway, I was playing the piano, and I used to put my foot up on the stand when I was playing, and I put my foot up anyway, and I had a new pair of shoes, and there was a sign on the front of the shoes that said "Sale £20." So everybody's coming up to me afterwards and saying, "I like your new shoes. They were great value, £20." Anyway, you're really welcome back, and we're going to discuss an interesting topic. And one of the things that I kind of said that I'd like to do throughout this series was to discuss some topics that aren't discussed very often in the church. So last week we discussed the reason for marriage. Next week I'm discussing church unity.
Great.
And the week after discussing with somebody else about why the Bible is not a scientific book. Okay. Which sounds pretty interesting as well, yeah. But today we're going to discuss a very interesting topic. And the one thing that I thought as I was thinking about this was, I can't think of anybody who I have ever read who said that the Bible is erotic, or that there's erotic writings in the Bible text. Obviously come from the Greek word eros, about, the god of sexual love, eros, and so about sex, erotic, and because it's not a word I think that a lot of Christians are comfortable with. So I said to one, I won't say who, I said to somebody, we're going to be discussing this, and they said, "Oh no, why?" And I said, "Well, it's there, and we need to discuss it." And first of all, why do you think we are so squeamish when it comes to discussing sex in the church? Especially before you get there, especially as we talked about last week about the hyper-sexualized world in which we live. And so the whole world is talking about sex, and the church seems to only talk about it in one context, and that is, don't do it. And why do you think we're squeamish about it?
It's a good question. I wonder, probably a whole bunch of factors. Maybe partly in a Sunday service, there's a mixed audience. It's a difficult, tricky topic to talk about. So maybe there's different contexts where you can talk about it, like in a podcast. I think there's a spirituality maybe of privacy, that maybe there's a bit of a Gnostic spirituality going on there. And what I mean by that, a Gnostic sort of splits reality into two levels. Yeah. Gnosis is knowledge, what we know. Yeah. And so you have us think, okay, what we know here, doctrine, truth is up here, and then there's the physical world down here, and the two are somehow separated. That was a thing in the early church. I think we can be quite Gnostic. In other words, sex, sexuality, all that stuff is a bit lower. Maybe it's not as spiritual, or it's not very. So we don't really talk about it that much. I don't know. I'm speculating here. Yeah. But I think there's maybe individualism. It's not our business. It's a bit like money. We don't talk about money a whole lot either. No. But it's those sort of private areas. Maybe we somehow think we haven't. The Bible has a whole lot to say about sex. And it has a whole lot to say about money. I know we're talking about sex. So. Well,
apparently, in this church, many years ago, when it was in Northumberland Hall, somebody got up one morning and said, or one evening, and said, there's two taboo subjects that really are never discussed in the church: sex and money.
There you go.
And you'll be delighted to hear I'm not going to talk about money. Which I thought was very funny. Yeah. But so the Bible commentators, weren't a bit squeamish in talking about sex. And I suppose, they were obviously, when we say the Bible writers, obviously we're talking about this massive period of time in which the Bible was written, thousands of years.
Absolutely.
And so there's even big difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, which we'll talk about in a minute. Yeah. So maybe you would just comment on what you believe is the difference between explicit references to sex in the Bible like from Song of Songs and what some of the prophets wrote about, and pornography. Because I was thinking, you know, I was talking to somebody yesterday evening, and they said to me, so what do you do, you know? And I said, oh, I'm a pastor. They said, oh, that's very interesting, you know. And they were asking me some questions about that, and they said, and what are you talking about? And I said, well, actually, I'm recording tomorrow a podcast and a thing that'll be on YouTube about sex in the Bible. And he said, I might watch that.
Yeah, you see, you tend to get
yeah, you know. And he said, but I didn't know there was any sex in the Bible. And I said, do you know what? If you go back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s in Ireland, the Bible would have been banned if it wasn't the Bible. It's so graphic in places that the sort, and the sort of books that were sometimes banned were an awful lot less graphic than mild. The Bible. Yeah. Very mild. And they were banned even for talking about sex. The Late Late Show. There was no sex in Ireland before the Late Late Show. Yeah.
Gayburn invented it.
Yeah. And so what's the difference, do you think, between erotic writings that are out there in the public sphere that we call pornography and between the erotic writings that are in the Bible, which obviously we don't call pornography?
Yeah, well, I think the fundamental answer to that is the use of sex, and pornography is a using of someone else for your own sexual gratification. So it's a selfish act. Sex is a product. Sex is something to sell. But that's not what you get. I mean, I'm talking about the positive view of sexuality in the Bible. Is there are graphic images of sexuality, particularly Israel. Like you talked about the prophetic tradition, Israel is often talked about the unfaithful partner who has gone after other lovers. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel, particularly Hosea is a
we don't talk about that a bit later on.
We'll come back to him. But there's graphic imagery of unfaithfulness and desire and seeking, pursuing other gods and seeking maybe fertility, harvest, wealth, security in other gods and not trusting in the Lord. So there's that imagery of unfaithfulness. And then there's also the very positive, particularly in the Song of Songs, which we'll talk about, because that is the great passage of sexual love in the Bible. And when I wrote the book, The Message of Love, I was determined to have a chapter on the Song of Songs because I've read so much about love and Song of Songs is not mentioned. It's like, oh, we won't talk about that. I'm going, you have to. It's there in Scripture.
Sure.
It's there. And the Bible has this place for this wonderful book which celebrates embodied sexual love between a man and a woman. And it's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, it is. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this talk at all was because I think that in many ways, the whole, sex has got away from the church, if you like, in that in our society, people have no difficulty talking about sex, and it's so blasé nearly, right? There's nothing that's kind of just left behind anymore. Taboo subjects that were never talked about are openly talked about on chat shows during the day. In the it's nearly sometimes you can't get away from it. And so somebody might say, well, listen, if that's the case, then why talk about it in the church? And the reason that I suggest that we do is because there's a very positive view of sexuality and sex that we're not talking about and that we need to.
I think, well, just to come in there, I think it's if the church isn't talking about sex, then either we're being incredibly naive to think that somehow if we don't talk about it, people are not getting taught somewhere else. I mean, the culture has an incredibly strong narrative about sex and sexuality, which we talked about in the previous podcast. But people are being formed by that. They live in that. I mean, social media and phones. We live in the most sex-soaked society probably ever in human history. Right. And so if the church is just shutting its eyes to this and how it's forming us and how it's shaping our thinking and our behavior, we're being incredibly naive. And so therefore we really need to take up books like the Song of Songs. We need to take up the teaching of sexuality in the Bible and teach it and talk about it and how it engages with contemporary culture and people's lives. Otherwise, we're just going to be, I think, seen as irrelevant. We have nothing to say. I know that you remember that Summer Institute with Professor Clean Harrison. Yes.
a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
Sex, the Gospel, and the Revolution.
Yes.
Because you actually did the first session at it.
Uh-huh.
As I look back at my notes because I couldn't remember his name,
Yeah.
and I went back to look, and then I said, "Oh, Patrick did the first part
Yeah.
of that talk." But I remember vividly. The room was full of pastors, and Glyn asked us how many of us had taught on Song of Songs as a sex manual, or as a way of talking about sexuality in the previous decade, right? Without just referring to it as an allegory, and not one hand went up, and he really challenged us, and he said, "Look, this is terrible. That in this whole room, there's not one. At least, if a hand went up, I didn't see it.
Yeah. Fair enough.
And so,
That wasn't yours.
well, it wasn't mine anyway. Yeah, and so, and he really challenged us to do this. And so I thought to myself, I've held that challenge in my heart, and I've said I wanted to do this. So when I had the opportunity to talk to you, I thought, well, this is great. I'll get Patrick to do it instead, which is, or at least with me,
And
to hold my hand.
My family would completely laugh at me as if I'm some sort of expert on sexuality and contemporary culture and all of that. But I think we do have to wrestle with the text, and we have to speak it because it's there in Scripture. I mean, it's fascinating. Song of Songs, many people in the history were uncomfortable with it being in the Bible because it's such an explicit book around this love and physical celebration of their physical love between a man and a woman.
Yeah.
And I think the book has had a checkered history. Within Judaism, there was uncomfortableness. Should it be in the Scriptures? Within the Christian church, the same. And I think, therefore, it's interesting, both within Judaism and within Christianity, there's been a long tradition of interpreting the Song of Songs as an allegory, you interpret it at a different level, and you sort of get beyond the sexuality of it by seeing this higher spiritual level of meaning.
Yeah, so that's kind of like the Gnostic thought you're talking about, yeah.
I mean, both within Judaism it was seen as God's love for Israel, and also within Christianity then Christ's love for the church. I've read a lot about that book, and I'm not persuaded by that line of interpretation. It seems to show an uncomfortableness with just dealing with the text as it is.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that reflects the uncomfortableness in the church. We don't deal with these issues for some reason.
I mean, I don't know what talk I gave one day, about something, and I mentioned something sexual in it or whatever, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Is there nothing that you can leave unsaid?" And I said, "Well, I understand that you may be uncomfortable, but it's there, So, so it seems to me that in ancient Jewish society, they had very strict rules about sexual relations. Like it had to be within marriage. There was the death penalty for adultery. If you had sex with somebody before they were married and they got pregnant, you absolutely had to marry them. And they had, you had to pay the price and all the rest of it. And they had like very strict rules around it. So that was one side of old, shall we say, Jewish thought. And then on the other side, though, they had this celebration of sexuality, which we're not so comfortable with, I think. And so Tom Gledhill, in his introduction to the commentary on Song of Songs, says that actually the song was sung, and that sexual union was celebrated, not something that was just a concession. What's he say? A concession merely to be tolerated. And I think that often we have it as a concession merely to be tolerated. Just leave it out there in the corner. Don't talk about it. It's okay. It's there. We know it's there. But just leave it there. Tolerate it, but certainly not celebrate it. And so, what do you think about that?
Well, I think this is why having the Song of Songs in the Bible is so great, and I think it is one of the most neglected books, and I think we need, particularly in our culture, to be talking about these issues. I think, coming back to your concession, I think there is a bit of a Christian legacy there too, in the Paul in Corinthians talks about get married if you must sort of thing, that if you burn with desire or lust, get married. And so within that comment, I think there's been a sort of sense, we'll come back to Augustine, I'm sure, in a moment, but it tends to see, sex is something to be controlled. It's maybe a lower, baser sort of motive or desire, and it's got to be confined within marriage. And so that's quite a very negative view of marriage as a sort of place to control lust.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's Paul's theology, actually, but I think that's a legacy that has come through also within the church, that it's within history it's tended to connect it with sin, lower desires. So we need a positive, good theology of sexual. Our bodies, the Bible has an incredibly positive view of our embodiment. We are bodied, physical, sexual creatures. That's how God created us, and we tend not to have a very good theology of the body.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, just what you mentioned movies before. I remember there was a movie years ago called Catholic Boys.
Right.
I don't know if you remember.
I haven't seen it, no.
And Donald Sutherland actually played the head priest in it. He was really good.
Yeah, I like
but in there's a part of it where they bring this priest in for a retreat, and he's all the boys and the girls there together, and they're about to have a dance. And before the dance, so they're all, say, 15, 16, whatever, and this priest gets up and he talks about the sin of lust. And he does this whole section about it, and he scares the living daylights out of me. There's burning coals to be got, for lust. And then he says, now enjoy the dance. The music goes off, and I think that that actually does reflect, though, a theology, not just in Catholicism, but within the church in general. You mentioned in the book about St. Augustine that he had certain views that affected the church for millennia later. So let's discuss him a little bit. Yeah. Because he's quite a complex character, isn't he?
It's a huge question, and the more I've read about him, there's a very complex full theology of sexuality and desire. I think Augustine talks a lot about love, and the book I wrote was about love. So Augustine, maybe the best way to understand him is think of love as desire.
Right.
And he sees love in terms of what do we truly pursue. And we're seeking fulfillment and happiness. What really motivates us. So love is seen as this inner desire. So, I mean, a famous passage in his Confessions, he talks about stealing a bunch of pears when he was a boy. And he reflects on this thieving these pears from an orchard. And he said the act of stealing it was what he was after the pears, not for themselves, but just the thrill of stealing them.
Sure, yeah.
And he didn't even like them when he got them.
Yeah.
But this desire to have what was not his. So he talks a lot about an introspective sort of look at desire, and he connects then, he has higher and lower desires. So again, like you too, took a bit of Augustine, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. He says we're looking for something and we'll only find it truly in God. And so our ultimate desire should be for God. And if we pursue other desires and seek other ways of finding happiness, we're never going to be satisfied. So this God-shaped whole, that's a very Augustinian way of thinking about desire and love. And he tended to think, well, our physical desires, human love for humans, sexual love, is of a lower order type of desire than our desire for God. And so therefore he has this quite, he talks about caritas, a higher form of love, and cupidas, a lower form of love and desire. So it's an ordering of desires is what he's about. And he tends to connect lust with this lower love. And he tended to then have quite a negative view of the body and sex as connected to this lower form of... So he thought singleness was better, but he did make a case for marriage, and he wanted to give a good, positive view of marriage. But really, singleness was higher, lower sex was often connected with lower desire, and it was also a theology of original sin that sort of propagated through sex. So he has this passage in his book about, in one of his, I'm trying to remember which one, City of God I think it is, where he talks about the original first sex act, right? You've got Adam and Eve.
Right.
And
added in the garden.
So they are united, and he talks about Adam, I'm paraphrasing now from memory, but he lies on the bosom of his wife, and without passion, without lust, without... You're thinking, that's very hard to imagine. But it's almost as if he's detached. He has such a negative view of this desire that he's only doing this in pure reason without lower, baser desires. And so this sort of, it's called a Neoplatonic, this Platonic idea of the body and higher spirituality and lower spirituality meant Augustine, I think his legacy has been to associate sex with lower desire, and it's therefore it's something which is connected to sin. And I think it then goes to your priest, who's that
well,
sort of legacy.
And kind of led, maybe to this idea, lie back and think of the empire,
Yeah.
And like for procreation purposes only.
Yes.
And I think that's why Song of Songs is so important, because there seemed to be this view in the church, and it was so certainly when I was growing up, and I know I'm a pretty old guy now, nearly as I'm older than you, I think, but anyway, this idea that somehow that sex was there for procreation, and anything in terms of enjoyment was not exactly verboten, but it certainly wasn't this celebration of sexuality, and that's why the book kind of maybe is confusing for some people. So maybe is there any sections in the book that you want to talk about specifically?
Well, I think that there's all of it's good, but in my book I focused on the chapters where there's this parallel pattern of the Shulamite, the woman in the Song of Songs, extolling the beauty of her lover, and then he extols her beauty. So they're doing this the whole way through. It's actually quite a tricky, complex book to understand.
Yeah,
there's a lot going
layers
on.
Of it, isn't there?
There's stories and cycles of description. Quite hard to understand the whole background, but it's poetry. It's song. It's not meant to be a prose, but what I love is the way there's a mutuality in it, which is extraordinary. I mean, you think of the ancient world again. Here's this. It's really often written from the woman's point of view, extolling the beauty of the man.
Yeah.
And it's a very earthy, physical description.
Yeah.
And some of the description is, whoa, it's very explicit. And then he's the same for her. But it's looking at the human form. They look at each other and they find delight and joy, and all the imagery is this. It is an erotic. So coming back to eros, there are 4 Greek words for love. There's agape, there's eros, there's storge, and there's philia. And storge and eros are not really in the New Testament, in the Bible, but it is. This eros is more, one way of looking at it is not so much just purely sexual, but it's a passion, it's a desire, somebody said, I love it, this, I think it's really good. Eros is love because of. In other words, you love a good sunset, you love good food, you love your wife.
Thanks very much, I do. Love both my wife and good food.
You love things because of their intrinsic worth.
Yeah.
You're attracted to things. That's an erotic type of love. So it isn't just sexual. So there's this passion and desire that they have then they're taking delight in each other's physical form, and I think it's fantastic within the Song of Songs. There's no prudery, there's no anything about it. There's just a celebration of that we're embodied creatures in physical form, and the female is given a very strong role. This isn't just it isn't just a male thing. They find delight and joy in each other. So there's a mutuality which is extraordinary within the Song of Songs. I don't know if that's answering your question. I can't remember what your question was.
I can't remember either, but it was a really great answer. I mean, there is this absolute beauty in it, right? And I do think that, we talked about the difference between this, erotic writings in the Bible and pornography or whatever. And maybe that is where we can describe the difference, whereas it's not, pornography is which is so vastly used in our society today. Is the instant gratification for the individual.
Yes.
And so using somebody else.
Yes.
Whereas the erotic writings of Song of Songs and so on seems to me to be, as you say, it's the projection of love within this relationship, and it's very, as I say, it's beautifully laid out there and so on, but is very explicit.
Yeah.
And the explicitness of it is, I remember Trevor Morrow years ago speaking at an event I was at when I was a kid, and he's a lot.
That's
older.
a long
He's
time.
he's a lot older man. And he was speaking at this event, and he read that part about the guy describing the breasts of the girl, and then he I don't know what, like some fruit or whatever. And he says, and I'll go and I'll take the fruit. He says, I don't know what that means to you, he says, but I know what that means to me when I read it,
Yeah.
And it was really clear, that this is talking about sexual acts where, and he's saying this is what God created us to be, beautiful, and it's beautiful.
She has this beautiful picture of the garden, she talks about the garden, but she welcomes him into the garden, which is again sort of sexual union imagery, and there's the tasting of the honey, but it's all, what's beautiful about it is it's all imagery and poetry. We're saying it's explicit. It is and it isn't. I mean, it's obvious what it's referring to, but it's also poetry. It's imagery. It's pictures.
And it allows you to use your imagination.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's this delight in a sensuous physicality to it. Yeah. Which is celebrating the fact of, as I said before, we're embodied creatures, and it's also young love, Ducky. You do get the sense this is a young couple, and they talk about husband and wife, but they're separated from one another, they're longing for one another, there's stuff going on where they've met and they're sort of longing and this passion.
You can still be like that when you're in your 50s, Patrick, do you not think?
Well, maybe the physical form might not quite be the way it was.
I know, yeah. Sure, yeah. No, I mean, listen, I'm 100% there with you. It is so absolutely beautiful and wonderful, and I do think it is so important that, because you think about, okay, so you say the language there is so explicit, or not so explicit. There's different parts of it, and it allows us our imagination to run wild and so on. And you're going, hold on a second though. I've always been told that I shouldn't let my imagination run wild with me. That I shouldn't read this stuff and get and allow sexual imagery into my mind and so on. And you're going, this actually, rather than kind of damping down our sexuality, seems to spice it up. And I think that's part of the, that's why the book is there, to give us this idea that our own sexuality is actually a positive, good thing from God. And it's not all about suppression, which seems to me to be where the church got to. And certainly, the reason I asked about Augustine, and so because it seemed to give this flow afterwards, where, for instance, the perpetual virginity of Mary, of this thing of purity being non-sexual, and that purity actually is about being non-physical as well, really, and negative views about the body, and the body's there to be trashed and and subjected and put down and so on, rather than to be enjoyed.
I suppose, and as we talked in the previous podcast, the Christian framework of that is within a marriage relationship, and the Song of Songs is within this marriage relationship of the husband and wife. So there's a celebration of that within that confines. It isn't just free for all self-expression.
No,
but I think it's holding those two things together gives a truly Old Testament to New Testament picture of sexuality in the body. Jesus' teaching, I mean, it does, as he says, Sermon on the Mount, where does he say, looking, you commit adultery as you look after another woman and want her for yourself. You can commit adultery in your mind. There is a framework there that this lust and desire and enjoyment of physical sex belongs within certain frameworks. When it goes outside that, then
that's where we started, exactly. Talking about, that there's always been these tight frameworks of sexual ethics, but it's just within that framework there's joy and celebration. Exactly. Okay, we're going to move on, because I wanted to talk before we finish about some more explicit language that one of the prophets used, and I'm going to read from Ezekiel 23, where the prophet compares Jerusalem to a prostitute, and he says, "When she carried on her prostitution openly and exposed her naked body, I turned away from her in disgust, just as I had turned away from her sister. Yet she became more and more promiscuous as she recalled the days of her youth, when she was a prostitute in Egypt. There she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose emission was like that of horses. So you longed for the lewdness of your youth, when in Egypt your bosom was caressed and your young breast fondled." That's extraordinarily explicit language. that the prophet uses to describe how God views the city and the people that he loves. And I want to ask you two questions about that. First of all, I wonder how shocking that was at the time when Ezekiel used that language. You know, like, did that absolutely shock the people out of their... Because I know if I got up in church on Sunday, right, and I used that sort of sexual imagery to describe the church today, I mightn't have a job the week after, right? And so, how appropriate... The second question is, so the first thing is, how do you think the people received that at the time? And then the second question is, how appropriate do you think that sort of language is for today?
Yeah.
I know that's a hard question.
That is a
and
hard
I'm asking
question.
to speculate a lot here.
I am. I mean, it's a deliberately shocking imagery, and that's a theme within the Bible that often Jesus' teaching is often profoundly shocking, and it's a picture, it's an analogy of unfaithfulness. I mean, this is there's that idea, and it is recurrent. I mean, see, Jeremiah does very explicit language in Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Of course, we'll talk about Hosea, I'm sure, in a moment.
Yeah.
But all of those, that prophetic theme of, I suppose, the Old Testament stories of Israel's continued unfaithfulness to the covenant and to her God, but that's often pictured in sexual unfaithfulness. So it's the unfaithful bride, and here they're lusting after other gods, and it's pictured in a very sexual image. So it's unfaithfulness, the unfaithful. It's destructive. It's breaking the covenant, and it's meant to be shocking. The prophetic word was always constructive in a sense. Well, it was doing two things. It was warning Israel. You know, you're being warned here. This is describing your behavior, but often with a constructive thing of repent, turn around, and come back to me, and turn away from that unfaithfulness. So I think that shocking language is often trying to bring people up short. To consider actually the spiritual reality of where they were. I think that's certainly what happens in Hosea. That's a very
talk to us a bit about Hosea before we answer the second part of the question. It might end on
Okay, well that follows very similar from Ezekiel. It's a shocking image, you know.
Yeah.
Hosea, go and
marry a prostitute.
Go and marry Gomer.
Yeah.
Who's going to be unfaithful to you, and it's a picture. It's like a worked out analogy and a picture of unfaithfulness, but the marvelous part of that story is, despite her unfaithfulness, I called
it's a terribly sad story, isn't it?
It is a sad story. It
is. Do you think that it's just an allegory, or do you think that it actually happened?
There's a big debate about that.
Is
it a picture? Did it actually happen? Was Gomer actually a prostitute, or was she an unfaithful wife? But I don't think that all matters too much.
No, I don't think so either.
The theology is, it talks about her children. You know, you are no longer my children.
I know.
No longer will you be loved. The covenant is over. It's broken. It's like God's going to stop. It's all over.
It's so sad.
Yeah. But the good news is, as you go on, and you get towards chapter 11 and you get others, God is, I called it God the betrayed yet faithful lover. And it's a fascinating picture of God as the lover.
Yeah.
He will pursue his unfaithful bride, and he will not let her go. And that's the picture of Hosea. He pursues this unfaithful bride. He brings her back. He forgives her. He wants to renew the covenant. And that's the fascinating thing about the language.
Yeah.
It's such a warning to Israel at the time, but God is saying, I am not going to break my covenant with you.
Yeah.
It's unbreakable promise. I suppose it ties back to our podcast last week of marriage. It's an unbreakable covenant. I will be committed to you. As the old vows used to say, through sickness and health, for good or for worse or whatever. And God's covenant is, his love for her is unbreakable, despite this really graphic imagery of unfaithfulness.
Yeah.
Which is great news for us, great news for me. I'm a sinner and I make mistakes and fail and do things wrong all the time. And without God's unbreakable covenant love for his bride, the church, we'd all be in big trouble.
And to me, even within, when you think about marriage and about being, as you've said, marriages can go through all sorts of ups and downs over the years, and there's all sorts of things that are good, bad, and indifferent, and sex within marriage goes up and down, and sorry, that wasn't meant as a pun, but things are at different times. You talk about being older and the issues that come with that and so on, and so to me, when I think about sex in the Bible, and Song of Songs and so on, and the imagery that's there among the prophets or whatever, and God pursuing people, we go back to where we were last week, about this covenant that exists there, and where it's not simply just about gratifying yourself, where actually it's about this deep covenant that exists between people. And so when it comes to sexuality, I think the beauty of what God has given us is there, but the context is so massively important, because the within the context that God has given it, it is absolutely wonderful and beautiful. But you move outside the context and you've got trouble.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm jumping here, but I suppose the
Jump
teaching.
away.
I'll jump out into the New Testament. I mean, that's the imagery of the New Testament of 1 Corinthians 6, and where Paul was dealing with the Corinthian church, and they seemed to find, some of them anyway, there was no problem going to prostitutes, etc. Within, and
because that's very much part of their society.
Yeah, and they seem to have had a view of the. I mean, there's debates what's going on there, but certainly Paul has given them a theological reason not to do this.
Yeah,
and it seems to be primarily this idea of your bodies now belong to the Lord, and you're united to Him. You're one in Christ. You're united in the Spirit. Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. So it matters what you do with your body.
Yeah.
And I guess this is coming back to, what do we think is spiritual? What's this? It's Gnostic ideas. Your spiritual is what you think and pray and do, and what you do with your body isn't so important. That's not Christian spirituality is very holistic, and it's saying sex is important. It's a spiritual issue, what we do with our bodies.
Yeah.
And Paul is saying, well, your body isn't your own, so how can you unite your body to a prostitute, because you're one in the Lord?
Yeah.
So there's a place for sexuality, and within the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament's within marriage, because there's a deep spiritual union there going on, and it's inappropriate to use that in other formats.
Yeah. So I know the Gnostics, they some of them went one direction where they took aesthetics, where they did nothing, the celibate and really promoted that, and then the other side that said, well, as your body is, just your body doesn't matter, they lived very immoral lives, And so maybe that's why we need to understand ourselves that type of thinking drives behaviors that are, and I think we can do that. I think a lot of Christians today are doing that. They're thinking that way, where they're saying, well, that's just my body, and this is my mind. And where I think we have to I hate the word holistic, right? Because it's come to mean so many things, but I'm going to use it anyway, right?
I think I just used it too.
Yeah, did you? Okay, well, I forgive you. But where you get to this idea where actually we are mind, body, spirit, where all the things that God has given us, in terms of our sexuality, in terms of our desires for all these different things, and for men, you talk about power and all these things, big debate in our society at the moment about consent, and so on. We're not going to go there now because we don't have time, but and within the context, it's about giving away power, giving away our own desires, or at least when I say giving them away, what I mean is by saying, well, actually your desire is more important than mine, and doing that in a marriage context, and sometimes that's really difficult, I mean, the story's told of the guy, I hope I get this right now, but the story is told of the guy. He comes to the pastor and he says, Pastor, can you talk to me? My wife doesn't want to make love with me anymore. And he goes, oh, and he says, do you know why? And he says, well, she says she's too tired. And he says, oh, and he says, well, tell me about her day. She says, well, she works with the kids and she's with the kids all day, and then she makes the dinner, and then she tidies up afterwards, and then she's to clean the house and do the ironing and the washing and everything like that. She said, I go to work as well, and I come in and then we go to bed. She just says she's too tired. So the pastor says to him, well, I have an idea for you. Maybe if you took the kids from her and told her to go up and take a nice bath, and you did the dishes and did some of the washing and cleaned up the house for her and everything like that, she'd maybe feel like having sex with you a bit more, And he goes, okay, can you think of anything else that could work? And you just realize that actually that all these things are connected, about desire, and about giving away ourselves in love to somebody else, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, final question
Okay.
before we wrap this up. And that is to go back to the question that you didn't answer.
Okay, I can't remember.
Well, no, I'm going to tell you what it is.
Okay.
And which is, because we were talking about explicit language that's there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm saying, you know, when I came to write my thesis for college, or my dissertation, which I'm sure you remember, and but one of the I can't remember the exact quote, but it was by the German guy who died during the Nazi era. What's his name?
Bonhoeffer.
Bonhoeffer, yeah. And Bonhoeffer talked about how much preaching had become really kind of boring. And now he was talking within a context within Nazism and Nazi Germany. But he said that one day he believed there would come this word that would be powerful, where again human minds would be opened and they would be shocked by what they hear. And the question I'm asking is there a place within the church to use the sort of explicit, maybe sexual language or language that the prophets used to shock people back into reality? What do you think about that?
I wrote this chapter on Hosea. I come back to Hosea because it's a truly shocking story. It really is. It should shock us. And I ask a question at the end of it. You've just asked me a question. I asked the same question at the end of that chapter.
You're like a rabbi now. You're answering a question with a question.
I said, if God was to send us a shocking sign act, a parable today to the church about unfaithfulness and faithfulness, wonder what it would be. And I left the question because I was thinking, I wonder if it would be around power and money, maybe money and wealth. We tend to think, for example, of money as a neutral thing, as a good, and if you have lots of it, great. I tend to think of the Bible as saying most of the message of the Bible is money is spiritually dangerous and we should be deeply cautious of it. I wonder, so there's an example. I wonder if some of those things around money and wealth and security and how we've been so, I love life, I love good food, I love playing a game of golf, love being human, but so it's not an anti-world theology, but I sometimes wonder whether we've lost the eschatological future hope, this radical nature of the Christian church. We're on aliens and strangers passing through. We're not to build up wealth, as Jesus tells us. Moth and rust will destroy. I think some of that materialism and living in a consumer culture, I wonder if that would be the message, that we would have a bit of a shocking sign act in some way from God. I wonder if he'd challenge as Western Christians anyway. Suffering, persecution, all of that stuff, we're very comfortable. And I wonder if that might be one of the big issues. So that's not the sexuality one. I'm sure there's ones there too, but that's one that occurs to me. I wonder if that might be a bit of a prophetic judgment on the Western church sometimes.
I mean, sure. But what about using shocking language?
I don't think, I have no problem using shocking language. No, I don't think so. I think because the whole purpose of it is to get people's attention. It shouldn't shock just for the sake of shocking. I don't think so. I think it isn't just being provocative. And of course the prophets do speak. This is the word of the Lord to you. They spoke with authority. But I do think I remember way back in college, for example, I was at a Bible college in England and books were going missing from the bookstore. People were stealing books from the bookstore. Christians were stealing. I know it's shocking to you, but apparently they were.
Well, that was in England. You'd expect that there, Patrick. No, I'm only joking to any of our English watchers or listeners.
I still remember whoever the chairman of the students, it was brilliant, I thought, what he did. Because he took a Bible, he was talking about this, but he didn't explain what he was doing. He started ripping pages out of the Bible. He was up at the front and he started ripping pages out.
What is he doing?
I still remember that. And he talked about, unless our actions match the words, it's of no value, no use. Just take them. And I still remember that image. So that sort of picture challenges people. It's a symbol, it's an image. And that's, we're imaginative creatures. So the scriptures are imaginative and they speak to our hearts as well as our minds.
Cool.
Yeah. So I don't know what that means you're going to do next Sunday in church.
No, I don't know either. I mean, I think once or twice I've tried to using kind of shocking imagery or whatever well, not for the sake of it, but actually because I believe it's there in the text or whatever. But I mean, I think a lot of the time we use very mute language. and because we can be a little bit scared of offending people or whatever. And you think Jesus really offended people.
He did.
And he didn't set out necessarily just to offend people, but because he broke the status quo, he affected them. And I do think that there is a responsibility on the church to break the status quo. And as you say, for areas like money and sex and so on, where things have become, should we say, the church has become afraid of offending people.
I think
we need to get beyond it.
And there's good reason for that. I mean, Irish culture, you look at what's happened in modern Ireland, and authoritarianism, a negative view of sexuality, the whole Magdalene laundry stuff of the shame and how people were treated, and all that appalling story of how the church used and abused its power over the vulnerable, and therefore the church has no moral voice in society, and nobody wants to listen because you failed. So I can understand the
so can I, yeah.
But this is where there needs to be, as we talk about sexuality, we need to speak from the scriptures, but we also need a huge dose of humility.
Yeah. I
like Glyn Harrison. We talked about him in the previous podcast. He had 4 words, I think, at the end of his book. He said the first one should be sorry. Sorry, we've failed. We've abused people. We've covered up sin. Etc. etc. And still going on in churches, as you know, high profile failures.
Yeah.
But there should be thank you, I think, is his next word. We should thank you for pointing out our hypocrisy and our failures, and our negative view of sexuality, for example. Then he talks about, what was the third one? It was sorry, thank you, and then one is can we talk? And I'm sorry, I've forgotten the fourth one, but that sort of dialogue of saying we don't have it all right.
No,
but we do have a beautiful picture in the Bible of human flourishing through human sexuality as God has given us this gift. But we need to articulate that and teach it, but do so with humility and listening that we've failed, and we haven't treated people who don't fit in well. And how can we demonstrate the grace and love of God in all of this, and aware that we need God's grace and forgiveness in our own lives.
Yes,
and not just speaking from on high.
Because we're all broken.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a great way in which to end our discussion today. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
And thanks so much for doing these 2 interviews or chats
Pleasure.
with me, and I'm sure we'll do another one soon.
Thank you, Dougie.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Good.